Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. About a year ago, I had the great privilege of going to Hillsdale College for the first time. And man, what a special place it is. I was there to give a lecture as part of the Drummond Lecture Series in Christ Chapel, which is an amazing new building that Hillsdale has had the courage and vision to build. And I wanted to take the opportunity, indeed the privilege, of giving that lecture to reflect on what I regard as one of the most important of all questions, and that is, what is human nature, and what are the conditions in which that nature can be realized? You know, I don't think there is any more important question for any civilization or culture to be able to ask and answer successfully than that. What are the conditions that enable individual human beings to become what they have in themselves to become? I hope you enjoy the lecture, and I hope you'll feel free to subscribe to and follow this podcast as together we think about how best to revive and renew a fully human culture. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. The college is pleased to present to you this next installment of the Drummond Lecture Series in Christ Chapel. This series means to address matters of faith and learning and how together they help us engage some of the weighty issues of our present moment. As is fitting in such a venue, in discussing such a thing, I'd like to ask you to please stand with me and let us invite our Lord, His presence among us, and His aid. Let's pray. Almighty God, you have been our Father and Sustainer and our heart's desire since the beginning. Out of love for mankind, you sent your Son Jesus Christ to restore the dignity of human nature. From the fount of your own generosity, you have graced us with the Holy Spirit to exalt us to heavenly glory. We thank you that you have created and now have more wonderfully restored your ineffable image in us. Grant us grace to behold this mystery as we ought, to offer our lives to your workmanship, and to do with courage and compassion all that we can to honor the dignity of every person. Be with us now and make us attentive in both speaking and listening to the eternal wisdom you have for us today. All this we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, world without end. Amen. Please be seated. Our lecturer for today is Dr. Stephen Blackwood, the founding president of Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia, which is just now wrapping up its first full academic year. Dr. Blackwood was born in Alberta, Canada, and grew up in beautiful Prince Edward Island in a big family. He's the eldest of 10 on a small family farm. Though, was it small because there were so many of you, or was it actually small? Surrounded by a loving family and the beautiful vistas of the Canadian Maritimes, he became convinced of the transcendent freedom and innate dignity of every human being. He developed a deep sense that the achievements of the past, of art, music, architecture, literature, philosophy, can speak to and illuminate us, and that this cultural inheritance exists for all of us. This conviction has guided all of his vocational pursuits. He sharpened his vision under the able guidance of remarkable teachers at the University of King's College, where he earned a BA in Classics, at Dalhousie University, where he earned an MA in Classics, and at Emory University, where he earned a PhD in Religion, as well as among colleagues in teaching at Cambridge, Paris, and Harvard universities. His primary academic focus has been on the nature of the human person, specifically as it came to be understood in ancient and medieval times, and on the evolution of the ideals, institutions, and cultural forms that enable human beings to flourish. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the National Post, the New Criterion, and Quillette. He explores many of his core convictions in his book, The Consolation of Boethius as Poetic Liturgy, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. In 2007, he married Nicole, an art historian. It's a pleasure to have you here as well today. God bless you. On the founding of Ralston College, Dr. Blackwood writes, "Grateful as I am for the inestimable gift of my education, I believe that most colleges and universities have lost their way, that they are failing to provide the liberating self-knowledge giving experience that many young people seek. I believe that we must found new institutions of higher education that are adequate to the hunger of the young, and I believe the flourishing of a fully human culture depends on such institutions. We at Hillsdale College, of course, could hardly agree more. I am pleased to welcome a scholar, entrepreneur, and educator, Dr. Stephen Blackwood.
Thank you very much, Father Rick. What an immense pleasure it is to be here at Hillsdale College for the first time. I've heard so much about Hillsdale over the years and had a deepening admiration during those years, and so I was brimming with curiosity and excitement when Nicole and I arrived here yesterday, and though it's been only just shy of 24 hours, I'm more moved by what this college is than I had even expected to be. The clarity of purpose, the inspiration, the love that brims over in all of you. At least all of you that I've seen here so far today is a great inspiration. Hillsdale looms large in this country, as you all know, especially large in what we might call the conservative imagination. And I think it's worth maybe pausing to think for a minute about why that is, and how a relatively small college in a very small town in this part of the country could loom so large, could become so big. In a sense, that's at the heart of what I want to say today about how the small can become large, because you are a small thing that can become large, or perhaps is already a thing much bigger and far more expansive than you think. I think Hillsdale in particular looms large for many reasons, but above all, because it cuts through the noise of so many isms, relativism, materialism, and perhaps especially presentism. It cuts through all of these for holding to and seeking to discover truth, which transcends the relative and the merely material and the imminently present all at once. So it's very good indeed to be here. Thank you, Dr. Whalen, for inviting me, and for all of you for coming today. I've got one of those two-part titles in my talk, and one part of that title is Radical Thoughts on Human Nature. Like so many other words in our contemporary, let's call them language games, radical has come to mean the opposite of what it really means, at least, let's say, historically, etymologically. Radical comes from radix, radices, in the Latin meaning root. So when I say radical thoughts on human nature, what I'm hoping to do is to spend a few minutes sort of trying to uncover what is fundamental, or at least some aspects, some fundaments of what the human most essentially is. Spent a good bit of time thinking about what the ancients and the medievals call the soul. And though I doubt anything, in some respects hope nothing I have to say today is original, one of my points is perhaps that each of us comes to these universal things in particular ways. And I suppose what I have to do today, or what I'm hoping to do today, is, well, we have a metaphor in English, to take one's bearings. It comes really from the age of the origin of the compass. and it pertains to knowing where you are and where you're headed, especially in absolute terms relative to true north. I suppose, especially for the undergraduates and other students here, what I'd like to offer you are some sort of questions or ways of thinking that I hope might be helpful as you take your bearings in a big sense as you go through life. Perhaps it's helpful to, as I settle into talking a little bit about human nature, maybe it's helpful to just observe that our time and culture lack, in my view, anything remotely resembling an adequate view of human life and human nature. The signs of that failure to come to terms with an even broadly speaking sense of what the human is are widespread, and I would say in many respects dramatic, even increasingly so. There is the rancorous political and civic life that we not only hear so much about at such a high volume, but are in a way constantly surrounded with nearly everywhere we turn. That is partly to do with the dominant nihilism in which politics is thought to be the only or most important sphere. Everything is political, of course, we're always reminded. Then there's the degraded aesthetic and artistic life. It may seem as I'm describing another world, I know, sitting here as you all are in this magnificent chapel, but we all know at the same time what I mean. The disregard for beauty, the disregard for the dignity of the human being. Then there's the dopamine-fueled robbery of your attention, or at least of mine, by devices designed to do just that. Then there's the instrumentalization of your whole life, not only your attention, your whole life, by programs, economic or political or whatever else they may be. All of this, I think, has led to what has left us with quite a useful shorthand in the meaning crisis, which broadly speaking we might summarize as a situation in which very, very many people, countless millions, find themselves without the tools to make sense of their own lives. In a certain sense, they end up like Hamlet in the other half of my title, in his exclamation in Act 2, "What a piece of work is a man." It's quite an interesting speech he gives there, because he's in a way able to see all the powers of the human being in the abstract, all of its magnificent gifts, but he's left sterile, seeing only a quintessence of dust. But my question is, can that dust live? To quote from the prophet Ezekiel, can these bones live? And what would it mean? And how? Now, I know that deadness of spirit isn't remotely true of Hillsdale College, even after just a few hours, let alone in this glorious chapel, which is itself a kind of edifice to the living spirit. I heard the beautiful Scuola singing, and I came in for a quick visit earlier. Beautiful liturgical music. But at least in my experience, even many bright, morally serious young people like yourselves are sometimes caught in a kind of meaning quandary from another angle, a kind of anguish of youth and opportunity, perceived pressures that lead one, at least tempt one, to live life for other people's expectations, or out of the pressure to make a living or other pressures of the necessities of life, to instrumentalize your own life. I mean, we can do lots of things for another reason. We might go to such and such a school to get such and such a degree, in order to get such and such a job, in order to have a certain level of material security, and so on and so forth. But you can't live life that way. Life can only be lived for itself. And only you can live that life. And how do you do it? At times like this, when we're asking questions like that, we need a true radicalism, a return to root, as both anchor and nourishing source. We have the great joy to live in the city of Savannah, a very beautiful American city, and one of the iconic aspects of Savannah are the oak trees, these mighty live oaks. And the oak, of course, is this mighty towering tree, but it's grounded by its roots that are an anchor that hold it there in that great strength. They're also the source of its nourishment, these little things that become big, that nourish that whole tree. So I think maybe before I say anything about human nature, perhaps it's helpful to ask in a sort of very simple sense, defining our terms, or at least kind of adumbrating our terms. What is a nature? Well, let's begin with plants. Perhaps you've had that experience of putting a plant in a bad place, or forgetting about it, or forgetting to water it when you're away on vacation. It comes back and it's dead or dying, or you put it in a bad spot in the house. By contrast, what you sometimes say about plants, we sort of almost anthropomorphize them. We say, well, he's really happy over there. He's doing well there. What do we mean by that? Well, I think we mean that the plant is able to become itself. A plant, any living being, any piece of vegetation, any flower, any tree, any blade of grass, has let's call it in philosophical terms, a concrete potentiality. It can't become just anything. A daffodil can't become a fish or an eagle, but it can become a daffodil. And what a daffodil it could become if it had the right chance, the right conditions. What are those conditions? Well, plants generally need sun and water and carbon dioxide to photosynthesize their nutrients. Beyond that, different kinds of plants and flowers and trees need different kinds of nutrients from the soil. And in the soil, some like acidic, others alkaline, some clay, others loamy, and so on. There's a finite particularity to the nature, to the potentiality, to the horizon of possibility of any living thing. Take an acorn, for example. That acorn is potentially an oak. But this is really something I want to try and make as clear as I can. That realization of that acorn's potential is not inevitable. A lot of acorns don't become oaks. In fact, most of them don't become oaks. They cannot find the soil to take root in, not have the water or sun. They can be cut down. Any plant or flower, in its seed form, it has this concrete nature, both in its sort of potentiality as a thing, but also for the conditions according to which that potential can be unfolded and actualized. And I think it needs to be said, it's always tempting to start thinking about these things and you end up already kind of abstracting it again, as if all daffodils or all oaks are the same. Well, they're not. Each one is unique, and each single seed will require ultimately different care or conditions. So much for plants, though we could stay on them a while, and anyone who's studied botany and other such related disciplines will know how inwardly complex and intricate any one of them is. But let's, as we're thinking about what a nature is, let's talk for a minute about dogs. I don't know if you've ever had a little puppy. What an immense joy a little puppy is. We have a dog. His name is Ugo de Carpi. He's named after a Renaissance Italian printmaker. You can imagine where that name may have come from. He's a little long-haired miniature dachshund, and he really is the light of our lives. Well, you can think pretty easily sort of see there's a distinction. And it's no knock on plants to say that when you get to a dog, it's not kind of simply a material reality anymore, though even with plants, you'd want to hasten to say, well, the way they turn to the light and the way they react to their conditions, there is a kind of self-developing plant freedom there. It's hard to describe, but you couldn't say it's nothing that can't quite be captured by a kind of materialist language, already almost incipiently calling out as a kind of reciprocity. But still, undeniably, a dog is something else, a conscious being, more complex in many respects than any simply vegetative being. But how does a dog become all the things that a dog can become? It too has a given potentiality. It can't become an orca or a daffodil or an oak tree. It can only ever be a dog. But what a dog it can be. I mentioned our dog when we were having a bit of a rough time back when we thought about casting about to see whether we would, maybe a dog might improve our day-to-day lives and expand our home. And I was skeptical. I thought, oh, it's so much work. You got to take care of the dog, and you're traveling and busy schedules. And oh man, when this little creature came into our lives, I know we're just talking about a dog here, but I've just got to tell you, it was one of the cardinal moments in my life when I realized I had no idea what I was talking about. I had no idea how wonderful, how complex, how much reciprocity, those of you who've had and come to know and love dogs in your life, you know that they know things about you that you don't know about you. In fact, most of the things that they know about you, you don't know. A dog is an amazing thing. Dogs have souls. Not human souls, but they have souls. But all those things that a dog can become and that our little Ugo has become for us, they are not inevitable. Lots of dogs are unrealized, neglected, badly behaved, beaten, forlorn, homeless. What does it take to realize a dog's nature? Well, interestingly, if you compare it to the daffodil or the oak tree, it's not just kind of food and shelter and safety from the environment. It takes another level of kind of complexity. It takes direction and discipline, certain rhythms of conscious interaction, affection, very importantly. And all of those undertaken with a particular dog's nature in mind. So plants, dogs, their realization is not inevitable. They can be suppressed, torn up, destroyed, neglected. But perhaps you can see where I'm going here. I'm trying to wrestle with what a nature is. And the question I have is, well, what kind of thing are you? What does a human being look like, fully realized? What are you made to become? What is a human being? What do you look like, to speak metaphorically, if you were to be a bird in full flight, a horse at full gallop, a fully actualized being? What would you look like? And what are the conditions for becoming that? Well, interesting, this is actually where we get the word culture, cholera in Latin, or we get the word cultus and cultivate. Culture is really simply, in the kind of origin of the word, simply the soil in which a human being can grow. But it's also what you need to think about in terms of your own life, for your own realization as a particular human being is not inevitable. We said a word about the meaning crisis. The fact is, very many of us, very many of our fellow human beings, perhaps some sitting here today, find themselves degraded, unrealized, not in the place or having the possibilities to grow. And there's far too much of that, in my view, in our world today. And that's a fundamental failure of culture itself, if ever there was one. The thing is, though, you can't realize that potential without knowing the thing's nature, and that's what I'm trying to figure out here in just a few words today. A couple years back, my brother and his wife spent a fall and autumn in Greece, and they were living at a place that had, it's the autumn, and the olives were falling down, and they thought, we've got to do something with these olives. And you may or may not know that you can't just eat an olive. They're not palatable. You've got to preserve, you've got to brine them, and it's a kind of a process. And unlike, say, an orange or something off the tree, you can just eat. And so they didn't know how to brine an olive, and so they did what any reasonable tourists living in Greece would do, and they called their neighbor, Konstantinos. They said, Konstantinos, help us out. And they had kind of already gotten started with the brine and the salt and the water, and Konstantinos said, I don't know. It's my grandmother who's always preserved the olives. So he did, of course, what any reasonable man would do. And he called his grandmother, and he said, Grandma, tell me, do you do it like this and that? And she said, no, they've got it all wrong. The olives will be ruined if they go about it this way. And anyway, it's a simple point that I want to make, and that is, you can't so much as preserve an olive without knowing its nature. But if you could know what you are, you might be able to find your way. That would surely be worth the greatest of care, as the most precious of all things. That wisdom would be the pearl of great price relative to your own life. Aristotle, in his book on the soul, says that to attain any assured knowledge about the soul is one of the most difficult things in the world. Well, it's not for no reason that he says that. Self-knowledge is hard. Perhaps that indeed then is the place to start when we're thinking hard, when we're thinking radically about what a human being is, by nature, essentially and universally. That is, with the desire to self-understand. That we long for such knowledge is indeed a fact of our nature. This is the first radical aspect of the human nature that I'd like to try to delineate. We have evolved, and I'm using this language intentionally, as self-conscious creatures. Creatures for whom their own self-understanding and longing for self-understanding is a non-negotiable fact of nature. This is not optional. It is a fact of our evolved nature. And it flies in the face of the dominant worldview. So the dominant worldview is, of course, that there is no spiritual nature to the human being. We're just a bunch of, material processes inevitably, deterministically proceeding. Whether you understand that dominant worldview from a kind of materialist determinism or nihilism or constructivism? How about no? You have a free self-understanding, and a lot depends on it. I can tell you where it leads if you don't listen to it. It leads to a life you yourself do not regard as meaningful, substantial, or worth living. What does this self-consciousness mean? Well, it means that the soul is a kind of infinity. The mind is able, in a sense, to confront anything. The otherness of the world, of difficulty, of pain, otherness. That aim to understand is like the roots driving deep in search of water. And this too is where an abstract vision of the human, or an abstract vision, let's say, of freedom, fails. Because you have a determinate nature, and also to some degree are living in determined conditions: place, time and history, family, genetic makeup, past experience. These are things you can't change. And so a real notion of that self-conscious freedom, it can't come down to simply freedom from. It used to be freedom in, and even when it is freedom from, it's freedom in. I had the gift of living a good part of my life with a younger cousin named Garrett, who was born with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which essentially a disease in which every day of his life his musculature became weaker. First were braces, then crutches, then a wheelchair. Then for many, many years, he could really move barely a finger. He had very expressive eyebrows and lips. He was amazingly expressive, could tell stories with those eyebrows, Garrett could. He, though, and remember, he had memories of being able to walk and run. He, in his last years, really could not move at all. And yet, he discovered an incredible life of the mind. He pursued first, he didn't think he was going to live long enough to go to college, so he didn't go initially. And then he said, well, I'm still here. Went off and got his undergraduate in political science, then a master's degree online. He was an amazing inspiration. When I say the mind is a kind of infinity, that the soul is a kind of infinity, I don't think I'm resorting simply to metaphor. I want to start to try and draw out here already that the great realization of your gifts, your freedom as an astonishing creature, is inherently linked to the finite challenges and conditions, indeed frustrations, of your own life. It's not outside them, but in them. And this can't be done for you, this kind of discovery. We have a phrase, some people talk about thinking for oneself. I just think it's absurd. If you're thinking for yourself. There's no such thing as, someone else, you're thinking but not for yourself. It's called not thinking if you're not thinking for yourself. If you're thinking for yourself. But this grappling with yourself, it takes that. No one else can do that for you. And it depends on you in a profound sense. I know you probably heard Dr. Arnn, man I greatly admire, often speak about Aristotle. And in the Ethics, Aristotle says we become strong by lifting heavy things. And this is a deep insight in Aristotelian philosophy about the substantiality of the will. And it cuts both ways, because we all like to think that we're free and self-determined. And there's, the one side is you're free and self-determining, and the other side is you're free and self-determining. And you have all the burden of your choices that will determine you. And so the greatest care needs to be taken with what you do with the precious time that you have. And that brings me to the second radical aspect of the human nature that I want to briefly point out. And the first, which might say, is self-awareness, is that free, self-determining spiritual nature of knowing and willing, if we want to use the wonderful Augustinian language. The second is that the content of that life, of that knowing and willing, paradoxically can't be found simply within us to be satisfying. Meaning, a word often used these days, and a good word, can only be found in what we regard as transcendent, as larger, as greater than ourselves. This is the kind of paradox of meaning. It's something you experience in yourself, but in relation to a good that is upper, higher, and further beyond you. And the moment you start thinking about the things that you think you're worth giving your life to, I mean, man, you are right in the thicket of the deepest, biggest realities. You know, truth, beauty, justice, forgiveness, love. These are things worth living for and in relation to. Contra the scientism of our day that holds that only empirical things can be really real, I mean, that really is just nonsensically wrong, both from the standards of intellect and rationality, though we don't have time to go through the arguments in detail, and from the most practical, empirical standpoint of what works in the world. Had a lovely encounter at Ralston College this week with Anthony Daniels, the cultural critic, who you've probably read under the pseudonym Theodore Dalrymple, and he was researching a book, and he told me that he came across a very moving anecdote during the Great War. There was an epidemic of typhus in Serbia, in which half the Serbian medical profession died. The French decided to send a medical commission to halt the epidemic in Serbia, which it did. 100 volunteer doctors were called for. These doctors knew they had a 50% chance of dying if they answered this call. 50%. They needed 100 volunteers. 3,000 volunteer French doctors responded to a mission that they knew was likely to end in their own death. That was on my mind today when our wonderful tour guide, Michaela, gave us a tour of the college, and she mentioned to us that at the time of the Civil War, here at Hillsdale, 80% of the men of this college answered that call. Now, those are big, moving, historic examples, but the fact is, I would argue, we are surrounded by this. You are surrounded by those transcendent realities in your parents, your siblings, your friends and teachers, by a reciprocity. Let's call it an infinite economy of positive sum exchange. Let's call it an economy of love. This is what the philosophers teach, the theologians and poets, and indeed, I would argue, what the sciences illuminate. This, too, flies in the face of the dominant worldview and its obsession with power and coercion and instrumentalization. But I think it needs to be said very clearly that a trite understanding is not an argument against the truth of deeper things. Enough, I say, of the blatant failures of scientism, determinism, nihilism to account for the most fundamental things, for the substantiality of reality itself, for the substantiality of yourself. We need better answers to better questions, and I know that is the work of this college and in each of your lives. I think we should not be afraid or shy away from confronting the patent idiocies and inadequacies of the dominant worldview. And yet still, the question remains, how do you find yourself, find your way in relation to those eternal realities? And this is the third and final aspect of human nature, let's call it, of this radical conception of human nature that I'd like to touch on, which combines these first two: your own self on the one hand, your personhood, your subjectivity, the you on the one hand, and the whole life of these eternal realities on the other. For it's in the relation between those that our realization takes place. Aristotle says philosophy begins in wonder. The word he's using there is thalmadzein. It's kind of astonishment, amazement, an encounter with the God, something beautiful, a work of art, a breathtaking scene. I think that's a fundamental beginning point. I mean, if you don't have wonder and amazement about your life, and I mean your life, and the human beings around you, go look again. One needs to begin with the innate superabundance of reality itself, and then to approach that with both humility and courage. And these, I think, have come to think, are fundamentally related. So it takes humility to have courage, and it takes courage to have humility. I know this series is devoted to faith in the life of the mind, at least in part. And in a way, in those very topics, you have the perennial discussion, conversation, dialectic, you might say, between revelation and reason, between poetry and philosophy, between intuition and discursive thought, let's say. And I really think it's absolutely essential that you begin by listening to the voices that call you out to those higher things. I think it's essential not to subordinate your life along the way to that, to anything other than that. Because there's only one way to end up living the life that is yours, and that's to listen to the voice that you know, the still small voice that you know is calling you in your particularity. Once had an amazing experience. I was working on my work on Boethius, and I discovered in Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy this, and I didn't make this up, I just discovered it, like stumbling over a rock in a field or something is all I did, but what I found was there was this enormously complex, poetic, rhythmical structure in Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, and we were living in Vermont. It was the year after we got married, and I was just overwhelmed at this artistic, literary complexity of this work, and I thought, is it really? Well, I know it's there because you couldn't make it up, but does it really matter? I mean, is it just a kind of game? I sort of developed this. I started realizing as I got thinking more about these, you might say, these fundamental realities of patterns, how they mediate time and eternity for us, and that's another talk, but I had this amazing experience. I was wondering whether this was just too complicated. It just couldn't have an effect. And my brother had been visiting, and he went to take the bus home, and I dropped him off in Burlington, and I was driving, sort of thinking about these this work of literature, and I was, how it is when you're writing something and you're really in it, away from the rest of the world, and you're really it's kind of, space of speculative understanding, but I still was just not convinced. And I was driving, and there was a woman at the side of the road, and she was clearly in really great need, holding a kind of garbage bags of her personal belongings. I pulled at the side of the road. I don't normally pick up hitchhikers, but she just seemed that she needed help. So she jumped in the car and sort of threw her things in the back, and she was upset. She was crying. She had a very complicated history. She was a person from a difficult family, and all those sorts of multi-generational patterns of sad things, let's say. And anyway, I got to talking with her, and I was trying to calm her down, and I said, well, what do you like to do? And she said, oh, I love to knit. She said, I love knitting. I said, oh, are you knitting anything now? And she said, oh yeah, she said, I'm knitting this thing. And she said, it's pretty complicated. She said, I don't know if I should get into it. And I said, well, tell me more. And she said, well, there's sort of 12 sections of this blanket. There's sort of 12 sections, and each section has 6 colors, and the colors repeat according to this. And I was lost. I mean, this thing was complicated. And I said, well, what do you love about knitting? And she says, when I'm knitting, I lose myself in the pattern. Well, what I want to say is that the eternal is in you. You are far more intricate a thing than any quilt or any work of literature could ever be. Those eternal patterns are in you. In some sense, you are the eternal pattern. So that self-discovery is really, to use the Platonic language, a kind of remembering of what is already inside you, kind of like the seed. And self-knowledge is thus an awakening of the self in the world, through which what was in you, and you might say forgotten or not yet known, becomes explicit and remembered. But the thing is that this entirely presumes, and this only works because if what is in you is somehow also the nature of what is outside of you. Somehow the nature of the world out there must also be our nature. We could never find ourselves in it. Had the great literary experience a couple of weeks ago of reading a novel. Let's just say there was a girl born in Denmark in 1893, moved to Norway when she was 2, had an archaeologist father, used to go to the museums with him. She adored her father. He died when she was 11, leaving this girl and her family, her siblings, and her mother very poor. She had to give up hope of going to university. She went to secretary school instead. She spent her 20s as a administrator, you might say, not in the easiest of tasks. Very tumultuous marriage, very challenging circumstances. And yet, and I don't even know if we should say and yet, maybe the word is, and because of that, she had a calling to write. Between 1920 and 1922, she wrote a 3-volume work called Kristin Lavransdatter. This is Sigrid Undset, the third woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1928. I've only read the first volume now, I need to say in the interest of full disclosure. But my goodness, this is fiction of astonishing insight and power. The amazing thing is, if you read that book, and I hope you do, you'll see these little bits of her biography, about which I know very little, all over it. The point is not about winning prizes, of course. It's about the way the particular is redeemed. I think it needs to be said, it's very, very easy to forget this. In fact, most of us, I would say, forget it most of the time in a certain sense. No one in the whole history of the universe, past, present, or future, is made to live your life but you. So my exhortation is to discover in your particularity what is there, with courage, humility, and wonder, and to help others see that for themselves too. For to be in that, you might say, economy of reciprocity is inherently to be in relation to others. But see, it comes down fundamentally to this ultimate, let's call it ultimate particularity. I don't know if you know the line of Hopkins, see, not a hair is, not an eyelash, not the least lash lost. Every hair is hair of the head, numbered. It's a wonderful scene at the end of Book 21 of Homer's Odyssey. Famous scene, I'm sure you all know, where Penelope tests the suitors and they string Odysseus's bow. Now, you may or may not know that the bow is a kind of image of the lyre, right? It has the strings. And the lyre is one of the metaphors that the Pythagoreans and others use to describe the soul. Well, none of them can string Odysseus's bow. Only he can string his bow. And when he does, and when he strings it easily. And when he does, he plucks it, and it sings sweetly through the hall. I know these are grand phrases, but I think they are true. The chords of the cosmos itself reverberate in you. And the sight of that reverberation is your irreducible, I think it can be said, kind of infinite particularity. I know that's a clash of philosophical terms, but you are infinitely particular. You must string the bow of your soul and let it sing. That irreducible particularity, that finite smallness of you, the intricacy and difficulty of your own life, is also where the greatness is. I encourage you with everything I've got to go out and find it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Blackwood has agreed to take some questions, so if you wish to string the bow of your questions, you approach the microphone, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. You described humans as self-determining. I'm wondering, what would you and/or Boethius say about how providence relates to this?
Sorry, could you say that again?
About how providence relates to our self-determination.
Well, that's one of the ultimate questions. I should have known if I was going to come to Hillsdale. I was going to get a question like that. Well, as you perhaps know, that's in a way one of the fundamental questions of Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, and his answer is in a way not unique to him. But I would say just a couple of things just quickly. The first is that we, at the level of our own subjectivity and history, I think we do see this dynamic of the relation between our being determined and not determined. And, you know, there's that sense when you look back and you can understand it. It was a word, the logos of your life is revealed to you. I think really there's a couple of things to be said there, and the first is that you know, the ancient medieval conception to begin with doesn't accept the modern view, which is that, you know, if there's a kind of determined character to things, then therefore you are not free. The ancients, and I mean, you know, pagan and Christian alike, this is just a fact of the tradition, they would begin by saying, you know, we are always in the eternal principles. I mean, they are what give rise to the very powers of our personality. So it'd be kind of absurd, in a sense, to say that the ultimate reality of the divine life undermines or contradicts human subjectivity when it is its source, fundamentally. And yet, you know, in a way that also is not an adequate answer to the question. Boethius will say that providence, that the perceived tension between our freedom of the mind and will on the one hand, and let's say the principle's necessity, God's providence, that it results that perceived tension is really the result of a kind of misunderstanding, because God's not foreseeing anything. It's all in an atemporal moment. And it's not determining you any more than my seeing you sitting there. He'll give this example, is determining you're sitting there. Just because I'm seeing it doesn't mean I'm forcing your will. But I think one has to go deeper into the question of how what is fundamental is not only the backdrop, but the condition and lively term, you might say, of our own actuality. It has to be in us. And you might say it's in us, precisely in our freedom. And I would finally just say quickly that, you know, I think the Greeks had a sense of this. You know, we just don't know very much going through this life. And I like to give this, I was talking to some of the students at lunch today. We had a lovely conversation, and it needs, I think, to be said that, you know, I give the example sometimes. During my doctoral studies at Emory, I was need to learn some German, and I went off to Middlebury College to study intensive German one summer. And I thought that I was there, you know, to learn German fundamentally, and I did, and I passed my exams. But that's not what that was really about in my life. That was where I met Nicole. And I had no idea what was going on when I went to Middlebury, what was latent in my choice. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's a deeper order operating. It doesn't undermine our choices. No one forced me to go to Middlebury. But what I'm saying is that providence in a deep sense is about the goodness of reality that we come to discover, both in what we choose and in what we don't choose.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackwood. One question. In regards to this meaning of crisis that we seem to find that's so pervasive in our culture, how, say just practically, for our generation, how would we reintroduce or reinvigorate meaning in the culture when most of us, if not everyone, as you said, is kind of a victim of this dopamine-fueled robbery, where we're all being suggestively trained to forget meaning just by the technology and even the economic and political interactions that we seem to find ourselves in?
Great question, thank you. And I think there's a lot that one might say there. First thing, I think you've got to unplug, and I'm not saying I'm good at it either, but I would urge you all to find guides for this very problem. And I don't mean just ancient guides, I mean people living now who can share wisdom with you about how to navigate these things. Because we were not made for these things. There's nothing about human history that prepares us for what these things can do to our minds, our brains, our souls, our dopamine circuitry, all of that. Nothing. So what I would urge you to do is find people who can be guides at that at a very practical level. And one of the persons that has been a great guide for me is a man named Cal Newport. And I would commend his books, Deep Work and Digital Minimalism, to you. I don't think this is something that we can approach with I'm just going to look at my phone a little less tomorrow. It just doesn't work. I mean, we're talking about a tidal wave of, you might say, biology and psychology that is weighed against you. And if you don't really think about this seriously, you don't have it. I really don't think you've got a chance. So that's the first thing I would say. You're going to have to pull back, got to withdraw. And then, beyond that, I think the ancients and the medievals, our whole tradition gives us wonderful things to work with. And above all, what that comes down to is keep your mind on things above. Give yourself over to things that are real and not simply in a kind of existentialist moment. I tried to say that you have to listen to the right voices. I really think that's fundamental, especially at the age of you being an undergraduate when there's so many pressures and trying to discern your way. I think it's very important that you listen to the right voices and not simply expectation or not simply perceive this, not simply instrumentalizing your life, but really the deeper wavelength. But once you've kind of locked into what those are, and of course we need habits of recollection and recreation, you might say, liturgical or otherwise, to keep ourselves in relation to those things. Once you've made big choices, we'll make big choices in relation to big things and then live each day in relation to those big choices. And, that's a simple formula, but it works.
In view of the hour, I should probably say we should say thank you and wrap it up, but I think I'll ask one last question. I'll take the privilege of the microphone to ask a final question. I knew a man who used to say, jokingly, I have friends I haven't even used yet. Now, happily it was a joke, but when you say instrumentalizing your own life, perhaps could I ask you to spend just a minute explaining quite clearly what you mean by we understand perhaps what instrumentalizing your friends or someone else might be. What would it mean, what would it be to instrumentalize your own life? And then I think we'll say thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Whalen. It's a wonderful question. I think it would be a lot like instrumentalizing a friend. I was saying earlier I've done a lot of sort of network building in my life, and And the thing is, it's always tempting when you're building a network to instrumentalize and think, well, this person might be able to, help me do this or open up this door or whatever. But that's wrong for two reasons. It's wrong, first of all, because it's immoral, because you're making a human being into a means, not an end. So it's compromising or degrading their infinite their dignity and their free agency as a human being. But it's also wrong because it doesn't work. I mean, it's inefficient. First, it doesn't work because human beings don't like to be coerced, nor should they. But it's also the fact that, it's a bit like when I was saying about going to Middlebury, where I met Nicole. I mean, if you think you understand what is going on in any human interaction before it happens, you don't understand what you're talking about. I mean, any single human interaction is infinitely richer than you can ever imagine. You have no idea what's going on in that before it happens. And so you have to be able to approach it with the kind of humility of saying, well, what is this? What's really in this? I don't know yet. And, by analogy, I think we can do this with ourselves. We can treat our own lives as simply instrumental. Now, I'm not by any means advocating that a kind of usefulness is not part of living a responsible life. I mean, we only have so much time and energy, and these are finite. These are by my own account in this talk, as it were, infinitely precious resources that we have to steward very carefully. But the question is, to what end? And if the answer as to the end is always something external, always external and subordinate in the sense of a sort of endless utilitarianism, it never gets to the, for this. Well, then you'll always end up external, you might say external to your own life, because it won't have the fundamental, for this I came, character. And any little thing, any little act of habit or intentionality can be the simplest, most prosaic, quotidian thing, I don't care. That thing done in relation to a kind of infinite, transcendent end takes on all the substantiality of that higher purpose. And so I'm not advocating that we live without purpose, but rather that in all of those things we seek to discover and be true to the higher end, which we lose, I would say, if we're always preoccupied with things that are directed towards lower pragmatic outcomes. Thank you all very much. Pleasure to be here.